Last night, as I was walking home late from CBE, listening, as I frequently am, to Spotify, my Spotify shuffle, or whatever it's called, turned to the Prince of Egypt soundtrack. And I present this to you as if that's totally random. But I find that this time of year, inevitably, I listen to it every so often. I listen to it. I'm oddly getting into the spirit way early for Passover. Now this I sort of imagine is kind of like when Gentile children get excited for Christmas in early November. I don't know about you. I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not ashamed. I feel this way. Maybe you do too. Thank you, Jordan, for the affirmation. But there are many reasons, obviously, to be thinking about Passover at this time of year. It's officially 6 weeks away as of this past Shabbat. And also, as we know, we've been reading the book of Exodus for the past few weeks, and we'll be onward. This week, it's Parshat Terumah, smack dab in the middle of the book. And as it happens, like most of Exodus, it actually has nothing to do with the Exodus. Instead, we now get 5 weeks worth of Parshas focused on the nitty-gritty of construction. Oh boy. Specifically, the construction of the Mishkan that we mentioned at the beginning of services, the tabernacle. It's not as exciting as plagues and miracles, but it is the next step in our people's liberation story. I read this week an article by Daniel Burkove out of the Lair House in Boston, who offers a clever new explanation for how the different halves of Exodus, the Passover story on the one hand, and on the other, the construction of the Mishkan, fit together. He points us to the very first chapter of Exodus, setting up the Passover story. We read there the words that many of us know by heart. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said, "Look, the Israelite people are too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them." So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Are Miskanot, storehouses for grain. Now we often think about the Israelites as if they're building pyramids in Egypt, but it turns out, the Torah says, they were specifically building storehouses for grain, granaries, which were at the core of Egyptian economic power. But that phrase, Are Miskanot, as Burkove highlights, is just a hair away from Mishkanot, which is to say, tabernacles. If the first half of the book is devoted to the labor of the Israelites building wealth and power for the Egyptians before being freed, the second half of the book is devoted to building power, as it were, for God. A different kind of construction project, a labor that might be backbreaking, but is also voluntary and spiritually driven. Taken as a whole, then, Sefer Shemot, the book of Exodus, is indeed a story of our collective liberation. And if we're paying attention, that liberatory arc is also the tale of different construction projects. Now you may be thinking, where is he going with this next? If Jewish liberation is bound up with our construction abilities, then we know the Messiah is still not here for a reason. Couldn't resist. We saw it coming. But despite that, seeing it this way in terms of construction projects made me think differently about the way that this book of Exodus operates, especially because of the ways in which the Mishkan, this tabernacle, the portable dwelling place of God, is different from other forms of construction. The parsha begins, Daber el bnei Yisrael v'yichu li truma, tell the Israelite people to give me truma, gifts. Me'ed kol ish asher yidvenu libo, tikchu et trumati. You shall accept gifts from me from every person whose heart is so moved. Right off the bat, we notice a key difference from the forced labor of the Egyptians. It's required that this should be voluntary. Never mind that voluntary gifts to God are commanded by God. That's a different story. It's supposed to be different, and it is a little different from Egypt. And the text then goes on to list all the many wonderful materials that God has a taste for: gold, silver, acacia wood, dolphin skins, and the like. But the whole point of this construction is clear from the most famous verse of the Parsha. Ba'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. Build for me a sanctuary so that I may dwell within them. The grammatical quirk is the key here. Build for me this structure so that I may dwell b'tocham, within them, as many of you know. In other words, the people are commanded to erect this structure so that God might dwell within them, not just within it, the structure. Now remember that immediately before this, in last week's Parsha, the Israelites make a grievous mistake, a bad mistake vis-a-vis construction. When Moses leaves them for a few weeks to confer with God on Mount Sinai, the people make a golden calf, a different kind of construction project, a sinful one, and one they pursue out of fear that their invisible God may have abandoned them or may not even exist at all. As many medieval commentators agree, God therefore commands them to build the Mishkan immediately after the golden calf episode to remind them with a physical dwelling, something they can see and feel and touch, that God is with them. The idea of this project is to give the Israelites a physical sense of purpose, not just a promise from an invisible God, but something they can work on together, something that can take them or that they can take with them wherever they go. V'no'ati lecha sham. And there, God says, I shall meet you. And thus, the eternal Jewish impulse to build institutions was born. That wasn't really supposed to be a laugh line, but that's fine. It's no surprise to me that the Israelites had to engage in a collective construction project to cohere as one people and to realize their mission on earth. We've been doing this as a people ever since, in every generation. The first temple, built 3,000 years ago, anchored the Israelites in their kingdom. The second temple did too. And then, when the temples were gone, along with their land, the Jews built something physical but portable in the texts of the Talmud. Wherever Jews went throughout the diaspora, they turned to this spiritual edifice of halakha, of Jewish law and tradition. They expanded upon it, coming up with clever exegeses to match their moment and place whenever and wherever they were. And soon enough, Rabbinic Judaism, with its ever-expanding bookcase, became the project of our people. And then modernity came in to scramble it all up, forcing Jews to ask, what next? Traditional Jewish modes and shtetls and melas and ghettos were no longer sufficient. So what else might the Jews build? 19th century German Jews had their answer: build big synagogues that look like other houses of worship, and maybe even like this synagogue here today. Zionists had their answer too: build a state. It's no surprise that the word bonet, or builder, is one of the key motifs in Zionist poetry and thought. Others, emancipated from the rabbis, sought to build businesses in Gentile society, and others sought to build movements for social change. All these different things were good in different ways, but they are not entirely sufficient for this moment in our collective life. The question now is, as it is basically in every generation, what is our Mishkan? What are we going to build? What is the structure in which we might encounter the divine, or more importantly, see our purpose and our mission in this world as Jews? The state of Israel is often described as the greatest modern project of the Jewish people. And to leave politics aside, that is fairly true. Second only to the Talmud, it is the greatest post-exilic project of the Jews, for better or worse. What about those of us who aren't there? What about those of us who remain in the diaspora? What about those of us who question the forms of Judaism that we inherited from Europe? Reform, conservative, modern Orthodox Judaism, Haredi Judaism, or for that matter, what about the structures we inherited? Synagogues, federations, and schools. Now, I'm not saying we need to abandon the synagogue, God forbid, obviously. Nor Reform Judaism, nor even Zionism. That's a different conversation entirely. But I'm suggesting that every generation of Jews needs a project to bind itself together. We do have a few good ones that we know well, repairing the world and standing up for justice. Those are high on the list. Combating anti-Semitism is also an important project in American Jewish life today, especially as many of you know this weekend, this Shabbat. But what are we building? Now, I promise you this is not a pitch for getting involved with what we're building over at Grand Army Plaza, although there's always that too. I think the answer is here in this room. Conventional though it may seem to come together and pray in shul, what it actually looks like I'm not 100% sure of, but what I do know is that whatever we build has to start with us as a collective, those of us in this room. Kol ish asher yivenu libo, every person whose heart is so moved. To come together and really grapple with what we need. Something to remind us of our connection to the divine, maybe. Something to give us our collective purpose in this world. Jews have always needed something physical to remind them of these things. That's why we perform mitzvot historically. That's why we come to this place. That's why our ancestors, ever so skeptical of the invisible commander on high, were commanded to build the Mishkan, this physical manifestation of the divine on earth. So what's it going to be now? We'll have to figure it out together. But like every generation of Jews, we need to build something together. That is our mandate always. Perhaps it's a world-class center for the arts at Grand Army Plaza, or perhaps it's community. Probably we'll start with community right here, which always requires tending and rebuilding. We'll figure out the answer together, but the process starts with asking the question. And as we do that, we might realize that whatever project it is that we end up doing or pursuing, we may be on our way to a new kind of exodus, pointing us toward the liberation that we've sought for thousands of years. Shabbat Shalom.